Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this evening's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Mike Isaac. I'm a technology reporter for the New York Times. Now, let me tell you a little more about Emily. She is a technology reporter for Forbes, where her TikTok coverage has won awards. A Harvard Law School graduate and a former criminal defender, she previously led the Plain View Project, an investigation into police misconduct on Facebook, and covered TikTok for BuzzFeed News. She's also a friend of mine, and I've known her for a long time, and I'm jealous of a lot of her reporting, so that's good too. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Emily. So I would like to start with what I think is kind of your untraditional background getting into journalism. I met you years ago, and I remember when we have an editor friend in common who became your boss, and I remember when he announced your hiring, I was like, wow, that's crazy. I can't believe she's doing this. Why would you get into journalism right now? But it worked out pretty well. And I'm just curious how you made it to this. Like, what compelled you to do this, especially with your background? I'm really interested.
I thought I wanted to be a professional violist when I grew up. So,
as we all.
As do we all. I went to Oberlin, double degree in the college and conservatory, spent a lot of time in the practice room and realized I didn't want to play the works of old white men for old white men for the rest of my life. So I decided I wanted to go to law school, which I did. And my first job out of law school was defending guys on death row. I loved that job. Thought I was going to do it for the rest of my life. It was really impactful. It was really meaningful. And in the course of doing that in my first year out of law school, I was investigating a police brutality claim, which was a normal part of the job. And some of the police officers in this particular case that I was working on had public Facebook pages where they were saying all manner of things about their work, about the case that could have been important from a sort of post-conviction challenge perspective. And some of the stuff that they were posting was clearly viral. They were these sort of angry cop memes. And I was like, whoa, what is this? How much more of this is out there? And so I ended up spending 2 years-ish of my life researching that question and building an interactive database of things that police officers said on Facebook, on public Facebook pages that could impact public trust in policing. That was actually journalism when I was doing it, but I didn't know that. And so I was just this like lawyer who had a research project. But what I was doing at the time was investigative journalism.
Wow.
And it was a big, important project that raised a lot of important questions about policing.
And this was when, like 20?
Yeah, this was like, I was working on it 2016, 2017, 2018.
Okay.
Project came out in 2019. So that was more than 2 years, actually. Anyway, what that project made me obsessed with was not police misconduct. It was the effect that Facebook was having on our discourse. Because in order to do this project, I went through the Facebook posts of many, many, many of America's cops, thousands of America's cops. And most of the posts weren't about policing. They were just about these people's lives, right? And I was watching the ways that people were interacting with political and civic discourse over the course of thousands of posts. A lot of these people, like, I was watching a diary of their lives, and that was really weird.
Yeah.
It was probably inadvertently public, which was also really weird.
Yes.
And I became obsessed with the question of like how Facebook was shaping our discourse and our realities, and how it was shaping policing was just a small part of that. So I become obsessed with this question. After this project comes out, Facebook sort of could have tried to sue me or try to hire me, and they hired me. And so I went and worked in Facebook's policy department, which was a fascinating experience about which I cannot say all the things. But
NDAs work, right?
Mike covers Facebook, so he knows. But it was a fascinating experience. And I got to think about the questions I wanted to think about. I got to think about the effect that Facebook was having on society and how it was leading people to have certain conversations or not have certain conversations, and why certain things were going viral. But at the end of the day, I was thinking about those questions on behalf of a corporation, for the benefit of the corporation.
True.
And what I really wanted to be doing was thinking about those things on behalf of the public in part of a public conversation. And that's eventually how I got into journalism. So when John, our mutual friend, announced that he had hired me, I had gone on to do similar work at Spotify after Facebook. But I eventually applied and, threw caution to the wind, wrote a really passionate cover letter and said, I want to do journalism. And John took a big risk and hired me, and here I am.
And it worked out. That's amazing. And so let's move to TikTok then. Now, Facebook is obviously super interesting. We both written about it, covered it, or thought about it at least for a long time. And now it's kind of this interesting zeitgeist shift around like what one of the, I mean, don't get me wrong, Facebook is obviously very important and it covers much of the world, but TikTok seems to hold a very specific type of engagement with folks across the world, how they use it, and came on like very quickly. But I want to shift back to the beginning of the book, 2014. There's this conference that's happening in China, correct? And it's sort of like a global summit of how the world leaders kind of think about the internet, essentially. And this is a different time in the era of the internet where the idealism of like Tim Berners-Lee saying this is gonna, information is gonna be free, everyone should be able to use it. This is like, nations can come together, people can learn things. This sounded like normal, right? now we're in this era of like balkanization, let's say, where that's kind of like not how people think, at least the same way. But how were, as these kind of social apps were rising up, how were kind of party officials across the gamut, whether it's in China or Americans, kind of thinking about it? And maybe talk a little bit more about this summit that I'm referencing.
Yeah, so if we go back to the platforms of 2014, or just a few years before that, we saw the uprisings across the Middle East, the Arab Spring, right? And we saw Facebook in the United States trying to carve out like, we are making a thing that brings people together and is sort of per se good for democracy and expression and freedom of democracy and expression. And I think a lot of people in the US and a lot of people in tech in the US felt that way. And they pointed at things like the Arab Spring to say, tech is an engine for democracy. And world leaders.
Twitter made a lot of
exactly. And world leaders in autocratic states were very nervous about that. They didn't like that. And they wanted to be able to control the internet. They wanted to be able to censor. And so at this conference, the Chinese government tried to get a bunch of private sector tech leaders from around the world to sign on to a sort of a document that endorsed an idea of digital sovereignty, which is basically, here in our country, we write the rules of the road for the internet. Over here in your country, you write the rules of the road for the internet. And that was the Chinese government trying to get these private sector leaders to say, you can control technology here and you can control speech here. And the private sector leaders balked. They wouldn't sign it. They were nervous. They were like, we're not really on board with what you're doing over here. And so the resolution never went anywhere, and the Chinese government just never talked about it again. But that sort of set the scene for a turning of the tide from this sort of optimistic view of tech platforms as engines of democracy to a question mark about whether they would ultimately be that or something else.
I mean, I don't even know if you were at Facebook when they had Free Basics, that program where they were trying to go into India and provide internet to everyone, and like.
I knew about it. I don't remember. I wouldn't have worked on it, but yeah.
But it's one of those things where right. Well, it's one of those things where it's almost the wide-eyed, optimistic view of statecraft, right? Of like, okay, as long as we can provide cell phones and internet to people and like this connectivity is a de facto good for everyone, right?
Or
maybe that
the
feels naive. I don't know.
darker version of that,
Yeah.
where we're going to bring all these people online and they're going to be reliant on us.
Right. And I think that, yeah, and I don't think it's wrong to say Facebook was thinking about it that way at that time.
Well, I'm not imputing that to Facebook. I'm just saying that is true too, right?
Yeah.
You can have wide-eyed optimism, and you can also have the convenient fact that wide-eyed optimism is also
Yep.
a bunch of people being reliant on you. So
I mean, I
both
think
things can be true.
I agree. And I feel like there's always like the sort of, I don't know. I think a lot of the time tech leaders out here can be like, all right, there's like a I'm forgetting the word, but like a kind of altruism that's self-reinforcing, if that makes sense. What is it?
There's nothing that like young idealistic tech people want to believe more than that you can do good while doing well.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think that's a thing that people want to have happen out here.
That's right. Enlightened self-interest is the phrase I was talking about. And that's probably like the nicest possible way of putting it. But so that was 2014-ish era. That was a long time ago. Things are obviously very different right now. But I want to kind of talk about the intro. Does anyone know what the app Musical.ly is when I say that? A few people, kind of sun nodding. Okay, so can you tell us what that is?
Yes. So Musical.ly is an app that you probably knew about if you were a middle schooler in like 2017, or if you were the parent of a middle schooler in 2017. It was the center of preteens world for a couple of years there. It was an app that you would go to record lip syncs and dances to top 40 hits. And if you were like old enough to drive a car, this thing was not cool. You did not go near it. It was not for you. But even kids as young as like 8 or 9 were absolutely obsessed with it. And that app was eventually purchased by ByteDance, which is TikTok's parent company today, and revamped and re-released as TikTok in 2018.
And that's one of those things where I'm really interested in Musical.ly because at the time, exactly what you said, like the big tech companies, the Facebooks of the world and Twitter and Google, were all focused on like long form, highly produced shows, things like that. Like short form video kind of hit them out of nowhere, right? Am I wrong with that? Like it felt like a very different thing than what Silicon Valley was doing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think part of the reason is that they didn't, I think a number of Silicon Valley companies were worried about making something for people so young.
Oh, that's interesting.
But Musical.ly became immensely popular with this very young user base. And they were by default, people talk about how TikTok is so much more authentic.
Yep.
9-year-olds are by default authentic. Among many other things, they are authentic. And I think that kind of came through and through a lot of detailed work on Musical.ly was the startup before it was acquired, on the startup's point, to really try to understand the users and give the users what they wanted, even when those people are like 12 years old. I think paid dividends because they were able to like really create a unique thing. It was very narrow, right? But a unique thing that everybody knew, oh, that's a Musical.ly, right? It's not just that's a video that you recorded. It's like there was a distinctiveness about the ways that Musical.lys were recorded that sort of gave it an identity.
And so I'm trying to lay the groundwork here because this stuff leading up to where we are now, I think is really important. And this is where ByteDance comes in. Mm-hmm. And let's talk a little bit about Zhang Yiming and ByteDance and this company that, let's say 10 years ago, maybe no one over here would have understood. Maybe Valley people probably have known it, but like most of the United States, I would say, had no idea. And tell me a little bit about him and maybe this company and where it kind of came out of, basically, and why we had to start caring about it quickly.
Yeah. So I think today, a lot of people would say that Zhang Yiming is one of the founding fathers of the modern recommendations algorithm. And he was obsessed with the idea of recommendations algorithms really early, back when the first ones were starting to pop up. And he had this lens of thinking about algorithms. He wanted to replace the idea of you going to the computer and searching for information with the idea that information could search for and find people instead of people searching for information. And the idea was, if you have indexed all the information and you understand it, and you understand all the people and what they're interested in and what they like, you can serve them stuff. You can show them stuff that they don't even know that they should be looking for, but that they really want to know.
Yep.
And like, in an idealistic way, that's an interesting idea. Maybe that's a more efficient way of transmitting information. It also has a kind of dystopian cast to it, where why would I cede to some corporation or some math problem the agency of deciding what information I want to know? That's kind of crazy. But we've all moved remarkably in that direction since 2012 or 2014, because we do less of going to the computer, looking for a thing, getting that thing and leaving, and do a lot more of open the computer and see what comes to you, right? And like, we used to use the thing, now the thing's using us a little bit more.
I really think that's important, because it does underscore what getting online used to look like, right? Like, even going to Google was a very intentional, or if you remember Alta Vista, if you remember like search portals from AOL and Yahoo and things like that, right? It was a super intentional act where and like search strings weren't all perfect. You could find like funky stuff. Search results were not great all the time, but like that was very much how we navigated the internet, right? And this shift to, I say the algorithm with like big scare quotes, but like shift to like algorithmic curation and serving things, I think like it seemed to kind of, we talk about it with like scare quotes now, but there was some pathway there, right? Like there were, I guess you could call Facebook was definitely like a precursor to this, or
the news feed, right? You went to people's walls and then you didn't go to their walls anymore and stuff just came to you.
Yes. And that even then, this is also why it's sort of shocking to me that Facebook felt very late to what TikTok is doing, right?
Yeah.
Because they saw that just a reverse chronological timeline wasn't good enough. Twitter was not competing in the same way that Facebook was. But like, so was Zhang, he was the one that was kind of instrumental in saying this is the way the world is going? It seems super prescient.
He was very prescient. He was early to this idea. He was passionate about this idea. And way before ByteDance was on the radar of most people, even in Silicon Valley, it was massively impactful and important in China. And it became known as a sort of app factory, right? They had tons of apps. They still have tons of apps. They launch apps all the time. A lot of them don't work and then they discontinue them. But they throw stuff at the wall all day, every day, trying to get the next biggest thing. And their first biggest success in China was not short video. It was a news aggregator app called Toutiao, or Xinri Toutiao, which is today's headlines. And this news aggregator app was also the first one of the first really aggressively algorithmically curated, sort of personalized, bottomless feed type of products. And that was kind of scary to the Chinese government, because Zhang Yiming was out there saying, we're going to serve you the news that you want to see. We're going to figure out what you want to see, and then we're going to serve it to you. It's all going to be personalized. It's going to be great. And the Chinese government is like, wait, we want you to see the news that we want you to see. And that sort of early on put him and his sort of ideas about recommendations algorithm into tension with a government that was nervous about that.
It seems super Western. Like, did he have any Western education, or was he just like, he seemed pretty, if that's your framework, if you're like, this is, the state enforced point of view or whatever, those seem like pretty radical ideas under that framework,
I don't know if, I think he certainly had has a radical devotion to using math and logic to advance the ways that we think about stuff. I think that is really, really core to who he is and how he thinks, and it always has been.
Yeah.
And, I mean,
maybe it's just like I don't want to, romanticize this guy too much, but maybe it's like, this is the internet, right? Like, how does the internet work? How should information be found or find people or whatever, like, I don't know.
I think like a lot of non-pejoratively said tech bros, I think he's really,
it's just a noun now.
Right. I don't mean anything by that, but I think like a lot of tech bros, he's really into efficiency. He's really into like, how can I get the optimal result out of this? Well, let me play out all of the, like he's very sort of scientific about it.
Sure.
I think like many of the tech founders that we see right here in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, like how can we make this work better?
Right, and to the extent that something like censorship is inefficient and doesn't seem like that's annoying. That's in the way of this, more efficient, more rational solution.
So, okay, so we're in let's say we have moved pretty quickly into the age of the algorithm or whatever, like how are Americans, I always try to figure out, it's hard for me to get a grasp on how Americans like feel about this. There seems to be like a level of ambivalence. Like on one hand, it's like, I don't want to be controlled. I don't want, someone to tell me what to do. And then I'll go home and watch like 5 hours of TikTok or something in bed. Or like my wife will walk in and like just see a blaring screen while I'm trying to sleep. So like how I know it's very embarrassing. But how do you feel like let's just stick to Americans, like just sort of like picked up on this pretty quickly? Like, did we adopt it in mass? It sure seems like it. Or are people like, maybe we had time with it and now we feel a little weird about it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think Silicon Valley talks a lot about friction and removing friction from products. Like the Amazon Buy Now button is so beautifully efficient that we all buy now more things than we used to.
I hate that thing.
Yeah. And the idea of removing that much friction, I think as consumers, we walk through the world and we love a frictionless experience. And then we regret the frictionless experience. And I feel like that's what's happening, right? Like you sit there and you open TikTok or you open Netflix or whatever, and then 3 hours later you're like, that didn't feel good. I'm not happy about how I just did that. But you love the frictionless experience in the moment. And so I feel like now we're in this place where like many people will put timers to like limit themselves on certain apps, right? People will like, there are devices, you can get a brick thing for your phone now. You can get a pouch that will turn your phone off. Like they're all
one of those the other day.
See, like they're all kinds of things.
It's very important to my life.
There are all kinds of things that we're now doing to introduce friction back into our lives because we realize that actually we want some friction. The buy now button is not the best. And so I think it is now sort of, the onus is now on the consumer to stop and introduce friction, whereas it used to be less efficient to buy things, to spend the time and watch the ads, right? And that's a win for Silicon Valley or tech in general, no matter where it's from.
No, that's a really, the shift to consumer is super interesting because normally regulation would play a part in this, the whole thing. And that's kind of, it's another part of the interview, I guess. But here's my experience with TikTok. And I'm trying to divorce it from my early experience with Facebook because I've been on Facebook so long. I don't know how many things I've clicked yes to just skip and keep going. But when I would sign up for TikTok, the point I'm getting to is around data and data collection. When I would sign up for TikTok, the number of notifications asking me for my contact list, for like I need to be able to send you a zillion notifications at a time. Like it just feels more encroaching to me than, let's say, some Silicon Valley apps that I'm familiar with. Am I overstating that, or would you say it's on par with that? Because I don't know. I've had Facebook so long, I can't remember what permissions I've given it, but TikTok feels like particularly intensive.
I think another thing that we're experiencing is a reduction in time. Like, how many permissions have you given Facebook over 10 years?
Really good point.
And then TikTok grew so fast and happened so fast that it may be a similar number of permissions that are just like reduced. I don't think TikTok's types of data collection are fundamentally different from most other tech giants. one thing that TikTok does do that I think makes it feel different sometimes is the extent to which it relies on our revealed preferences instead of our stated preferences.
What is that? Can you tell me?
On Facebook, you friend people, you follow accounts, you basically tell it what you want to see. Sure. Same with, something like YouTube. You rely on the search bar much more, right? Mm-hmm. On Instagram, you have your friends.
Those are TikTok, like explicit, this is what I want to see because I'm following Bob or whatever.
And even if you like or share stuff, right? That is a more explicit signal. TikTok, you open and it happens to you. And you do nothing, except the thing is you are doing things because you're deciding exactly how long before you scroll. You're deciding what to skip. You're deciding what to come back to. And the platform famously relied much more heavily on those implicit signals of like, oh, you linger for 2 more seconds on videos about addiction. Or like sometimes they're not things that you thought you were telling it, but you ended up telling it. And so people would say, oh my goodness, TikTok knew I was pregnant before I was pregnant, or TikTok knew I was gay before I was gay. And it's like you are inadvertently revealing things just with where your attention is held or not held. And I think that makes it feel more encroaching sometimes.
It actually goes back to my favorite conspiracy theory of Facebook is listening to me on the microphone all the time because I got this ad when I was like not expecting it or something. And like the point I always make to people is like, it doesn't need to listen to you on the microphone because it already has a bunch of collection that's going on all the time. And that the implicit signal is a super interesting way of putting it. Slowly building to our current moment, but I'm curious so I remember a New York Times column a long time ago saying TikTok is like the last fun place on the internet or whatever. And there was a period where that was how people felt, right? Like it was like, oh my God, this is delightful. I'm seeing people dance. I'm seeing dogs and cooking, whatever. And I felt the same way. And then all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, it turns into this is the tool that is going to infiltrate and destroy America. And maybe that's not true. But how did that shift start happening? Was it a DC thing? Was it other companies sort of like lobbyists sort of coming in? Like what did that progression kind of look like?
It was a combination of things. Yeah. There was a group of China hawks in DC who felt that way for a long time before it blew up. Yep. And like Marco Rubio was on this train like basically as soon as Musical.ly had rebranded as TikTok. He was like making these posts being like, TikTok's awfully fun, isn't it? It's also a Trojan horse. He has a long track record of like, he was really about that. But it didn't, that viewpoint was sort of confined to a relatively small group of hawks until at least after the pandemic, when TikTok became way more central to American life. TikTok took off during the pandemic in a way like growth that you've sort of never seen in any other company in Silicon Valley at that sort of speed and scale. And that's because we were all bored and stuck in our houses and it was different. And it was like, you could do it socially distanced. It was great. But I think that's part of it, right? That all of the sudden, this thing that really was just kids like dancing and lip syncing became much more a place where people were talking about everything, right? It became much more a place where adults were talking. It started to be a thing that politicians used carefully. And
like campaign and like promote themselves.
Yeah. There was Donald Trump's first attempt to ban it. And I don't know if that's before or after the moment when you feel like all of a sudden there was this sort of huge anti-TikTok movement.
I think it was like leading up-ish to that sort of thing.
I mean, so a bunch of mostly teenage K-pop fans decided to reserve tickets to a Donald Trump rally in 2020 and not attend that rally. And I don't know that that's when Donald Trump first learned what TikTok was, but it seems definitely possible that is the first time that Donald Trump learned what TikTok was. And soon thereafter, he announced that it was a huge national security threat and he was going to ban it. I'm not going to allege causation there, but correlation is strong.
I mean, never anger the K-pop fans, right? Is that like the rule of thumb?
That is definitely the rule of thumb. And that's actually like in 2020, this was not the only incident where people angered K-pop fans and had serious repercussions. I mean, during the Black Lives Matter protests, the K-pop fans flooded the hashtag White Lives Matter with dancing memes. They were just like, no, if you're going to search for White Lives Matter, if you're going to try to do that, all you're going to see is K-pop dancers. And like, these were like 13 to 15-year-olds essentially running like low-key influence operations on the internet for fun.
Oh my God. I mean, that is nonviolent resistance, I guess,
Sure
right?
is.
That's pretty amazing. So like, let's talk about you, because you end up playing a role as this stuff starts happening. When did you decide TikTok was going to be a reporting target for you, or how did that sort of get on your radar as a reporter?
I wrote a story about TikTok that in another universe might have been just one of a couple that I wrote about TikTok. But every now and then, as a reporter, you turn over a stone and it's clear that there's so much more there. And that's what happened. So my first story on TikTok, which basically nobody read, was when I was at BuzzFeed News. And I went and talked to a bunch of people working in TikTok, and they told me about a secret project at the time known as Project Texas. And they said, mid-2022, early 2022, they said, we have this big project where we're essentially trying to rewire all of our internal systems to cut off access to US user data on TikTok from all of our Chinese colleagues. At this point, TikTok is owned by ByteDance. Tons of like engineers working on TikTok from China, ads people, dashboard people, like people doing all kinds of stuff, many of them in China. And as these people explained Project Texas to me, they were trying to remove those people's access to private information about US TikTok users, not because they thought that their Chinese colleagues were bad, but because they were worried that the Chinese government could show up at their house, put a gun to their head and say, you have to give me all the data.
This was a proactive move by them, or like, why not? Why then? You know what I'm saying?
At that point, ByteDance was negotiating with the Biden administration and trying to sell them on the idea that TikTok wasn't a national security threat. So like, Trump tries to ban TikTok, fails because he's legally sloppy about it. We don't have to go too deep into that, but that's what happened. And then leaves office. Biden comes into office and he's like, okay, we don't have to ban TikTok. We're just gonna like talk to them and see like if there are issues, how can we mitigate them? We'll sign an agreement, we'll move on. So at this juncture, TikTok has been talking to the Biden administration for a long time about like, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna remove the risk that the Chinese government could try to use TikTok or ByteDance as a security threat. No problem. We'll fix the problem. We understand your concern and we're gonna fix it, right?
This is still under Biden. This is
under Biden. We're in 2022. And so I write the story saying, hey, there's this thing called Project Texas. Here's what they're trying to do. And then I get an email, which is a very fun email to get as a reporter, saying, Project Texas, want more? It's a really, really good email to get if you're a reporter.
That.
Yeah, no, it was really fun. So I talked to the person who sent that email for a while, and eventually that person sends me audio recordings of more than 80 internal meetings at TikTok about Project Texas.
All right.
And that's a pretty big deal when it happens. And what the audio shows is that TikTok and ByteDance are trying to solve this problem. But right now, they have not solved the problem, right? In 2022 or in 2021 into 2022, when these tapes were being made, all of that US user data was widely accessible to many people in China. And there were a lot of people in the company who were pretty worried about it. And so I write a story saying that based on this big leak of audio.
Like everyone can still access it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that spurs a big news cycle in the United States. It spurs a lot of sort of congressional interest in TikTok and ByteDance. And then TikTok and ByteDance, or at least some employees there, make the really, really, really terrible choice where they say, okay, this is terrible. There was this big leak. The leaks must be stopped. And the way we're going to stop the leaks is that we're going to watch where the reporter is going and see if any of our employees are going near her physically.
Oh, that seems smart.
And the way that they do this is they pull my IP address from my phone from TikTok and try to match it to the IP addresses of any TikTok or ByteDance employees, which means they're low-key spying on me and all of their staff to try to see if we're in the same place at the same time. So like, I'm like laughing. This was the biggest unforced error imaginable. Why would you do this? What were you thinking? Like,
did you find out?
Yes, I found out. I found out and I reported on it. And then it became an absolutely huge scandal that like TikTok's parent company ByteDance, which absolutely swore it wasn't spying on anyone, was actually spying on reporters. This happened to me, and it also happened to a woman at the Financial Times, Christina Criddle, who also had this happen. She was also doing reporting on ByteDance that they didn't like. And so the company first denies it, then runs an internal investigation with like Covington, the white shoe law firm. And then they're like, actually, we did do it. We're really sorry we fired those guys.
Oh.
And you really want to figure that out before you deny it. But they didn't do that. So anyway, this ends up becoming just it's a comedy of errors from like when I started reporting on TikTok, you asked, how did TikTok become a reporting target?
Yes.
By the time we get to people at the company using terrible judgment decided to surveil me to figure out who my sources were, at that point I'm like, oh my God, I just want to cover this company all the time. What else is going on there? And so that's how I became the TikTok reporter.
I think that's pretty crazy. And I feel like it's probably, if you run a company, do not spy on reporters that are going out.
It's never going to work out for you. It's not a good idea. Like, first of all, it's wrong. But second of all, they will find
just
out.
Pragmatically, don't do it. Right. Good Lord. That's insane. So I'm assuming that inflamed things and made it worse.
Sure did. Did not help their regulatory problems.
So that's I mean, we're getting closer to where we are now, which is like that. I can only imagine empowers China hawks like Josh Hawley or Rubio or Peter Navarro during the first Trump administration, I guess second now too. Right. And so does this sort of like cycle of, legitimate reporting and like concerns, does that kick things off to another level at this point, or does it screw things up for one administration, or how does that sort of affect things?
It certainly doesn't help TikTok and ByteDance in trying to convince people that they are acting in good faith. But I think the problem, so I was talking about how they were trying to sell the Biden administration on, we're going to make an agreement, we're going to make these promises to you, that negotiation process was happening through a body called CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Mm-hmm. And CFIUS is part of the executive branch. It's very secretive. And it works with companies to try to mitigate what it sees as national security risks.
Got it.
And eventually, after the spying thing, but not necessarily because of it, the Biden administration says, yeah, we appreciate how much you guys have tried to come up with this series of separations and sort of ethical and technological walls, but TikTok and ByteDance are so enmeshed that we actually just like don't have faith that you can fully pull those things apart so long as ByteDance still owns TikTok. And so the Biden administration eventually says, you're just going to have to sell it or we're going to ban it. and TikTok and ByteDance at that point, they've already heard that they're going to be banned once and it hasn't come true. And so they sort of say, make me. And so the Biden administration starts working with Congress to try to pass a law that will make them. And TikTok and ByteDance are really angry about that because they have been negotiating with the government for many months. They've turned over confidential information to CFIUS. They've like talked all about their like internal systems with CFIUS, and they say, we just spent 18 months talking with you in good faith, and you just turn around and are trying to use all of that to screw us. And they wrote very angry letters to that effect. And the Biden administration, the negotiators on that side said, yeah, ultimately, nothing against you, but we just don't think this can work. And so they start working with Congress to pass a law, and that ultimately does happen in 2024. They pass a law saying ByteDance has to sell TikTok or it will be banned. And by sheer serendipity, the day on which it will have to be banned is the day before Inauguration Day 2025.
So this is my favorite part because like things start turning and suddenly both parties recognize that this is like a nuclear political football in some ways to ban one of the most popular consumer apps, if not in America, in the world. Like, how did no one kind of see that coming at some point, you know? Or what, do you have any sense of like just folks deciding, oh man, this is going to be worse than we thought it was? Or was it just sort of maybe Trump was like, okay, we can't afford to do this in a way, or we can use this against the Biden campaign? Does that make sense? Like, it just seems like something both sides would have figured out by now, but maybe I'm selling them short or overselling them rather.
I think so. The bill passed through Congress very, very quickly. And that was intentional on its proponents' part. They wanted it to move really quickly because they thought that if TikTok and ByteDance had a chance to lobby against it, that they could kill it, which is kind of interesting. Like, Congress doesn't usually do business in secret so that people can't weigh in. That's kind of a weird thing. At the same time, the tech lobby is very powerful, and Congress was trying to do this thing. And so the bill passed overwhelmingly. But I think a lot of the people who voted for it, one, felt sort of safety in numbers. Two, I think a lot of them thought that ByteDance would just sell. ByteDance was maintaining throughout this, we can't sell. And we can't sell because the Chinese government says we can't sell this algorithm. And ByteDance said, like, we can't disobey Chinese law. This isn't like a question of how badly we want to sell or not. It's a question of whether we're allowed to sell. And what the hawks in Congress were saying was, yeah, we know you're going to have to choose our law or their law, which is a pretty weird thing to ask someone to do.
Yeah.
And of course, disobeying Chinese law as a Chinese tech giant, like, they will maybe disappear your grandma, and they could disappear you. Like, there's not really due process over there. That's a very scary thing to ask people to do. And so I think some hawks in Congress said, yeah, you have the opportunity to choose our law over their law. And when you don't, that proves that you're a national security risk because you're going to follow their law, not our law. Right. And so it's this sort of game of chicken catch 22 gotcha moment. But sort of to answer your question about, like, why did people vote for this if it was going to be so unpopular? I think some of them thought they were going to sell. Some of them thought, like, they could force a sale, it would be fine. Yeah. We're not actually going to ban TikTok. We're just, like, putting some leverage on them. And I think a lot of the people who voted for the bill were hoping that would happen. And now we're in a moment where something that some people say is happening, but that's not really necessarily what's happening.
That was my question. Is, like, we have so I have asked my colleagues, I still don't know what's going on, but, like, supposedly we have a framework for a deal, I guess. Like, the other funny thing was that it went to Supreme Court. It was upheld. Like, this was, like, officially banned, but also it was off for, like, a day, right? Like,
right. So let's go back to that strike point that day before Inauguration Day, when, like, ByteDance said, we're not going to sell, we can't sell. And Congress said, yeah, but you have to, or we're going to ban you. And ByteDance says, yeah, we're not going to sell. And they challenged the law in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in Congress's favor. And so we get to the day before Inauguration Day, and Donald Trump has been reelected. And he comes back and he says, no, it's fine, guys. We're not going to ban TikTok. We're going to save TikTok. And at this point, not to diminish the power of the president-elect, Donald Trump is just a guy. He has absolutely no actual legal authority at that moment. But he goes to Apple and Google and Oracle and the big companies that are working with TikTok, and he says, don't take TikTok offline. I know there's this law that says that you could be fined astronomical amounts of money if you don't take TikTok offline, but it's okay because we're not going to enforce that law. And so you should leave TikTok online. And TikTok temporarily goes offline. It's not required to. The Biden administration says we're not going to enforce this. This is the next guy's problem. But TikTok does it sort of as a stunt. And they go offline and they send this series of messages to users saying, we're working with President Trump. We're so thankful to President Trump for saving TikTok and bringing it back online.
Remember that, yeah.
And there's this really weird vibe with a lot of TikTok's users, a lot of creators on TikTok, where they're like, excuse you, this is gross. This is propaganda. Like, why are you all of a sudden sucking up to Donald Trump? Like, this is not the platform that we know and love. And I think those were a lot of people who were skeptical about the idea that the Chinese government would use TikTok as an engine of propaganda. But when they see a leader in their own country that they are not fond of, it hits different, and they're like, shit, this thing could be used as an engine of propaganda. If this is just a pro-Trump platform now and I don't like Donald Trump, that's really scary.
Right.
And so I think the idea of their favorite platform being subject to leverage from a sort of autocratic figure that they don't like hit a lot of people for the first time at that moment. And so Trump gets inaugurated. He, carries out his threat or promise to not enforce this law. The president has a lot of discretion about which laws to enforce, it turns out. And so he just tells this DOJ, we're not going to enforce this law. Congress is actually pretty clear about which extensions can and cannot be granted and under what circumstances. And Trump totally ignores it. But he's kind of able to totally ignore it because the president enforces the laws. And so for 9 months, Trump, just based on his own discretion, decides that TikTok should stay online. He keeps granting 75-day extensions or 90-day extensions. And he says, yep, we're not going to enforce this law for X more days. And this is a really weird moment, right? Because Trump could at any moment wake up the next day and decide, oh, TikTok's woke now, I'm going to ban it, right? And if you're TikTok, you don't want to rock the boat. And so all of a sudden you actually do have a government figure who at least has a massive amount of sort of soft power over the platform, because the platform doesn't want to do anything that could possibly upset him, right? If he could just, in his discretion, decide whether it lives or dies. That's a really weird sort of interim time that we're in. We're not quite in that time anymore, though, or we're only sort of halfway in that time, because in the past month, Trump has announced that he and Xi Jinping and the Chinese government and the US government have arrived at some preliminary terms for ByteDance to sell TikTok's US business, and we can talk about how that's defined because it's weird, to a group of investors, most of whom are US based.
Okay.
And
that's the framework that I saw.
Yes, okay. That's the framework that you saw. And this framework, Trump holds up and says they had to, sell or be banned. And look, we did a sale. We're going to do a sale. We're getting approval to do a sale. And Trump's very clear that she has to approve the sale, that he can't do it by himself. But both Trump and Xi have to approve anything that ultimately goes through here. And so TikTok is under the leverage of two daddies now, as I say in the book. TikTok had a daddy, now it has two daddies. I'm not sure that solves anything. I think that's just double the trouble, but so Trump holds it up as a victory. We're following the law. We are, we're forcing a sale. This is what Congress wanted. The reason I said we need to be really careful about what is being sold.
Yeah.
There's a lot that we still don't know about the deal, but Reuters has reported that ByteDance will apparently still control advertising and e-commerce on US TikTok, which you would think would probably be a part of TikTok's US operations.
There's still a lot of content in advertising and e-commerce, right?
Definitely run info.
If that's your concern,
right.
If your concern is manipulation or whatever, then
right.
There are other levers to pull.
Right. So there are questions about that. Apparently, the algorithm will not be sold, right? The Chinese government told ByteDance it could not sell the For You algorithm. So instead, the new TikTok entity, if this deal goes through, would license the For You algorithm from ByteDance.
Oh, interesting.
And ByteDance would apparently be entitled to roughly half the revenue that would come from that algorithm too, according to Bloomberg. On the licensing point, there are a lot of types of software licenses. And if the license is just a clear cut of the code, do what you will with it, we're not going to update, then that's a pretty clean transaction. And you can't really argue that, ByteDance is still controlling that code. But there are also types of software licenses where you like can't change certain things and you have to rely on the licensor for updates and like all kinds of stuff like that. And so until we know what kind of license we're dealing with, it could be like, it could totally satisfy the Hawks' concerns, or it could absolutely not.
Just like
like, we really don't know what world we're in until we know more about that license.
Yeah, are they hard forking it, or
Right.
are they like ongoing sort of? That's a really interesting, and like that's the thing that this has all been so opaque and seemingly makeshift, like making it up as they go along, and like, are we abiding by the Constitution? Are we not? My like sort of dark humor about this was always like, if we're ending in a constitutional crisis because we're not banning like TikTok, then like we're in a real rough place. But it did, like, we're essentially like, it was just really kicking the can down the road for as long as possible. And it was very hard to determine how, I mean, depending on who you are, hard to determine how legitimate any of this actually was, you know?
Yes, I think of the constitutional questions that we're grappling with as a country right now, TikTok is not at the top of the list.
Fair enough.
However, I
Depends
will
if you're a
say,
K-pop stan, though.
TikTok has an immense amount of power, as do a few other tech giants, over our discourse. And understanding who has what levers of control over it is really important. So I'm going to take you back to 2022 when the Biden administration was negotiating with TikTok about like, we can make a deal, right? We can make a deal. You don't need to be banned. Terms of that deal would have given the executive branch, the Biden presidency, and any presidency that came after it, veto power over content policy changes.
Oh, wow.
So to be clear, like, what is a slur? Like, the government could have come in and vetoed changes to content policies, which I thought was bananas when I saw it. They could also veto changes to, like, executive leadership in parts of TikTok US. They would have had control over changes of privacy policies. Like, this agreement never got signed, but had it been signed, it would have given the US government totally unprecedented levels of control over the operation of an engine of speech. And we have no idea if there are terms like that in this Trump concepts of a plan situation. No idea. Like, that might not be part of it, but until we know what's in there.
If it was on the table.
If it was on the table before, I have a feeling that some of those Trumpy guys are going to be like, that. I want that.
We could do that. That's crazy. That's and like, so that actually is probably a good landing point for what I was thinking about, which is like, we spent what, the past, let's say 8 to 10 years worried about another regime and their influence over discourse. Now we're in a very turbulent point in American sort of like culture wars, democracy, you know, shifts in power, how you feel about, you know, the government sort of entering into different cities, telling you should or should not be able to protest, arresting different protesters, whatever your beliefs are, like the investor group and how close they are to the administration and how much they ideologically align with any one cause. Like, are we kind of just shifting, sort of like, are we just handing it to another different group of interested parties who are like, all right, we're going to do this now, you know? Like, I think that's, and like, there's probably no clean answer, because like, you could say that about like, how does Facebook create their content policies, right? Like, are they more or less efficient in like, figuring out how things go, or do they have like better people there? But are we just shifting deck chairs on the Titanic that is TikTok, or is there like, do you feel any better about these changes?
I definitely don't feel any better. I joked, but also not, it really is in the book, about TikTok having 2 daddies now, and like 2 daddies is not better than 1 daddy. Like, we want to get rid of government daddies for speech platforms, like no daddies.
That's the blurb on the paperback, by the way.
But I think that actually sort of is the thrust of where we land, is that like, I start the book by sort of setting the stakes about just how big TikTok is and just how powerful it is as an engine of speech. And I say, of course, autocrats, dictators, we're going to want a piece of that. Of course they were going to come calling, right? And TikTok is not the only platform that dictators want to control. They want to control them all.
Sure.
They will ban them. They will order them to do things. They will try to work their censorship into them. And by they here, there are anti-democratic regimes that are trying to surveil people, and regimes that are trying to stifle dissent all around the world. Sure. And there are certainly efforts to do that in our own government more now than ever. And when so much of our speech happens on platforms owned by enormous corporations whose incentives are to please the regimes enough that they can keep operating and making their huge amounts of money, we have a problem. And I don't think it's specific to TikTok, but I think TikTok is a neat little illustration of that problem and the way that governments will continue to try to use big tech to advance their goals.
No, I totally, and it brings us to this really interesting 180 of where Silicon Valley was 20 years ago, right? Or where we were talking about and like what we thought the internet was made for, you know, and
the Arab Spring optimism.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's interesting. I think about it a lot in terms of CEOs, you know, growing up and like becoming, you know, understanding what it means to be, to have fiduciary duties, or if you know capitalism means this about the survival of the company, like what are you gonna do? What is your red line or not a red line? You know, I guess the maybe the silver lining is that you know startups rise and fall pretty quickly out here, and so there's always like the just as quickly as TikTok came on, can there be other new different companies that do different things?
There will be other companies that do other things.
And like, you know, we have to stop, but like you talk about the role of encryption and like, I think in an era of public content feeling less safe or algorithms feeling perhaps different or less safe than before, like where does communication go? Does it go to smaller groups individually? Is it safer when you're encrypted? Are there trade-offs with that? Do we have to worry about like different things that are behind encrypted apps? So
Sam Altman wants privilege for chatbots.
Privilege? Oh God, do we need to talk about AI for the next 3 hours? I don't know. Maybe we should stop there. But I don't know. Thank you so much for doing this. This was super fun. I hope you guys had as much fun as I did just sitting here and talking to her. So I will just once again thank you to Emily Baker White, author of Every Screen on the Planet: The War Over TikTok.
Thank you to Mike.
That's good. She will be signing books in the back right after the program. And for more information about membership or upcoming in-person or virtual Commonwealth Club programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Mike Isaac, and thank you guys for joining us this evening.